Hey, Discern listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Teal Swan number 1. Katrina says, for me, her videos, Teal Swan's videos, were very helpful at some point of my life. I didn't feel any pressure to join a cult or something. She had helpful suggestions on how to work with emotions. Yeah, Katrina, a lot of people agree with you in my comment section and otherwise, of course, that Teal Swan was helpful, that it didn't feel like a cult to them, and they didn't feel any pressure when they watched the YouTube videos, when they went to the seminars, when they went to the retreats. It was all positive to them, and so that opinion or experience should be represented in this discussion for sure, and I value that. And I don't think that you, Katrina, are some sort of sheeple or something. You know, everyone has a different experience. M says, I'm really excited for this series on Teal Swan. I think Teal does a good job pointing out some of the issues with the current mental health care system, but then the way she builds off that gets sketchy very quickly. Reminds me of when pyramid schemes describe the real-life financial struggles people have, but then their solution only makes things worse. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you're pointing that out, M. It's a classic technique among many different types of charlatans, snake oil salesmen, pseudoscience gurus, pyramid schemes, some self-help gurus, religious zealots, politicians, and many commercials. And the way I see it, and I'm not the first person to describe this or notice it, but in the way that I describe it, number one is you present something that is true or seems true. Number two, you present a straw man of the competition. And number three, you present your unique solution to the problem that they have presented. So for example, someone might say, many people feel isolated and sad today. Mainstream psychology says you just shouldn't think about it, or they will just prescribe you a harmful pill. Well, I know how you feel. I will actually spend the time to listen to you. So sign up for my retreat. It's $5,000. So you see, they start with something that is understandable and believable and makes sense, or at least culturally makes sense. Like, many people feel sad and isolated today. It'd be hard to argue with that, right? And then they present the straw man. Mainstream psychology is bad at that. And then they present their solution, which is, sign up for my thing, it's $5,000. Another thing that people will say is like, many people today have chronic fatigue, and especially if you have chronic fatigue, you'd be like, yeah, that's me. And they say, mainstream doctors say it's all in your head, or there's nothing that they can do. So that's a straw man, because now some physicians will be that. So that's why it's like kind of true or true enough that it could see people believing it. And then what they don't say is, maybe you should find a doctor that understands or specializes in chronic fatigue. What they do say is, do you suffer from quantum fatigue? Do you suffer from chronic fatigue? And, you know, mainstream doctors don't know what they're doing. Well, quantum physics tells us that we all have a unique vibration. Of course, you're to some extent mixing up with string theory, and they say, you know, it's scientific. And again, if you don't know much about physics or string theory or quantum physics, the way they present it, and frankly, even the way some experts talk about it, it lends itself to these very pseudoscientific conclusions. But anyway, so they present that, and then they say, this magnet actually syncs with your quantum vibrations to give you energy. So again, they present the problem that a lot of people will be like, yeah, a lot of people do have fatigue these days. In fact, sometimes I lack energy. And oh yeah, I did hear about quantum physics that one time, and that was true, vibrations and da-da-da. Yeah, and mainstream doctors, you know, they never listen to me. And you know, but this magnet, you know, ties into, so if someone just came up to you in the street and said, this magnet will cure your fatigue, you'd be like, come on. But it's the sales technique. And there's so many other examples of this. It happens all the time. And if you watch out for it, you can detect it. It doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, of course, if they follow that format, but it does mean that they might be wrong. If someone starts with something reasonable, don't automatically assume that the next things they're going to say are also reasonable. Two, when they talk about their competition, note that. It's like, well, they're talking about the competition right now. How can I really trust them? Because they have an agenda. You're trying to detect their agenda, right? And then when they say, I am uniquely qualified to answer this problem, to, you know, find a solution to this problem, buy my thing or sign up for my thing or watch my thing or pay attention to me or whatever, then you should be able to go back and say, okay, because sometimes you don't know you're in a sales pitch. You're just like, oh, this is a presentation I'm watching. And then all of a sudden you're lulled into, and then you're presented this solution. So as soon as someone says something like, I am uniquely qualified to answer your questions or to solve your problems, you should immediately have a red flag and go back in time and go, oh, did that person just lead me down a road? How much of their argument did I just accept as true because they lulled me into a state of agreeing with them? And do I really know enough to evaluate what they're saying? Does this person know enough to even say what they're saying? And even if they do, you just have to be skeptical. You have to be careful about that kind of thing. Like, for example, I would hope that you've never heard me do something like that. I would never say that I'm uniquely qualified to help you with something. I'm constantly telling you to go to therapy, right? Meaning that there are millions or thousands of other therapists out there that are better fit for you than I would ever be, that kind of a thing. The other thing that I hope I never do is say someone like Teal Swan doesn't know what she's talking about, because, in my videos, I will say, she's saying a lot of true things, a lot of helpful things. I'm guessing she's helping a lot of people. So I would never call someone out and say, thus, you're an idiot if you follow that person, or that person is a menace to society. I mean, certainly some people are, but I don't have evidence that Teal Swan is a menace to society. There's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence that she's helpful, but we don't know, right? We'd have to study. And that's part of the problem with people like Teal Swan, is it doesn't lend itself to empirical study. Whereas people in my field and other related fields, there's a ton of research outside researchers that will come in unbiased and try to evaluate whether or not this model or this approach is effective and ethical. So it's just hard to know. I mean, Teal Swan could be better than therapy. She could be the same as therapy or drastically worse than therapy. And there's no way to know. And there's no way to gauge that based on anecdote, either direction. So you're kind of just rolling the dice when you engage in that kind of a thing. And so you just have to be really careful about it, Anyway, Authentistic says, the day has arrived. The loop has closed. I think the algorithm recommended Dr. Kirk to me at some point during my Teal Swan obsession. Now Dr. Kirk is all I watch, and I'd forgotten all about her. Yeah, a number of people said that they watched Teal Swan, and then at some point I was suggested to them. So it's like the algorithm somehow puts us in a similar place, which I guess makes some sense. Norberta says, thank you for being willing to publicly speak about suicide treatment, Dr. Honda. I don't know why, but my attempts to get treatment haven't been anything like what you describe. I've never heard of thwarted belongingness before, and I'm going to try to learn more about that concept. My experience has been more like Ms. Swan describes. The many therapists, nurse practitioners, and doctors I've seen just seem to want to make sure I can't attempt in the immediate future, and then they just kind of stop caring. I want someone like Dr. Honda describes, who actually digs into the root of why I'm suffering and helps treat that. My current hypothesis is that only the best therapists are both capable and willing to do that level of work, and that they are all in private practices that charge high hourly rates and probably won't ever be accessible to me. Yeah, so there's a number of things I could say to that. One is, I don't doubt your experience. You say you've been to many therapists, nurse practitioners, and doctors, and you don't get the sense that they are really in it to win it. They're not really there to care. They're in it to win it and there to care. They are trying to follow a protocol, or they're mainly concerned with just making sure that you don't die. And if they're reassured that that doesn't happen, then they kind of give up and drop the ball. So now, nurse practitioners and doctors, they're not paid to do that kind of work. They're overworked, and they're not even really trained. I mean, some of them are. I mean, certainly they're trained or care to have compassion, but in terms of actually getting into it with people, that is something that they can't necessarily even ethically do. Now, therapists, on the other hand, should. Do I doubt that you've ran into some therapists that are the way Teal Swan describes? No, I don't doubt that at all. I've worked with people like that. I've trained people like that, tried to train them out of that sort of a thing, and it's an unfortunate thing. So the problem is that there's not a lot of training, as I talked about in the video. Strangely, I think that'll change over time. A lot of misconceptions and a lot of avoidance of just death in general, including suicide, by our society, and thus psychology and psychotherapy, which resides within our culture. So Now, you do say, so I don't doubt that story at all. And I think that's why Teal Swan appeals to people. But what she says is, don't try to find a therapist that could help you. I'm the only one that can help you. She doesn't even say go to other gurus. She says, I am the only one. And so that's that thing I was talking about earlier. She might be the only one, but there's no empirical way of verifying that. I mean, there would be, but I doubt that she would ever submit herself to that kind of outside objective clinical trial. But then you say that only the best therapists are both capable and willing to do that level of work. I don't know what you mean by only the best. It kind of sounds like you're saying like top tier. And in my anecdotal experience, and I think research would show this as well, that it's not a top tier. We're probably talking about 50% of like the upper 50% of therapists, or the upper 50% regarding suicidal treatment, that kind of thing. So it's not as rare as you might think it is. It could be where you're going to find therapy. For example, if you have insurance through an HMO, for example, like Kaiser or Group Health, this kind of thing, their model of therapy is preventative and brief, and thus they won't probably get into it with you. Whereas if you have a different health insurance, like in my area, it's Premier Blue Cross. Incidentally, that's what I have. They tend to allow yourself to find whatever therapist you want to find, and they don't dictate the length of therapy. So it could be where you're looking for therapy if you had a number of therapists that weren't any good at that, because it's not that unusual. It's not unusual to have a therapist that is insufficient, but it's not unusual to find a therapist that is, as you say, capable and willing. And then you also say, and of those people in the upper tier, they're probably all in private practices that charge high hourly rates. And yes, that is probably true. And that's not a fault of ours. It's a fault of the industry and of politics and of money allocation. So in a perfect world for me, the government would tax people and provide free health care for everyone, and the therapy would be paid for by the government, and maybe you have a small copay or something, but everyone is entitled to weekly therapy if they have a problem, which if you suffer from suicidal thoughts, you have a legit problem, right? A medically necessary problem. The problem with that is finding the political will and politicians that will actually do that. We could do that. The United States could absolutely do that, and it wouldn't even be that big of an economic hit the way that a lot of people will claim. So if we did that, then you wouldn't be prevented from seeing any therapist, right? But the way the system is now, in order for people like me to make a living and pay off our student loans, we often have to go into private practice. And I work with a lot of people who lament that greatly. I'll have supervisees, myself included to some extent. You know, when we start out, we're working at agencies where we're working with very low income people that can't afford therapy at all, and thus are using government assistance for a variety of things, including getting therapy. But the pay is very low because the reimbursement from the government is very low, because the tax allocation for that expenditure is very low. And so in order to get ahead and pay off your bills, like for example, for me, I had student loans when I graduated from graduate school 25 years ago. Yeah, wow. And I got a job that actually paid more than average. That was an entry-level job at an agency. Actually, my internship just hired me. Full-time job, but I was going more in debt because the amount of money I made, I had to pay my bills, and I was, eating like top ramen, and I had very low rent because I lived in a small place. So I couldn't make enough money to even pay the interest on my student loans. So every month I was going more and more into debt. That's not uncommon for people, and that's a problem, right? Do we want that as a society? And economically, if we have to talk about it in that sense, when we provide people with enough mental health care, with enough support and preventative care, then we avoid a lot of costs that balloon down the road. For example, if you provide family therapy for a family going through some troubles, a child in that family is much less likely to drop out of school, commit crimes, have to use welfare later on in life, that kind of thing. It's proven, it's data. You put in $1 of mental health care and support for people in a variety of ways, and you get that you save $10 down the road. It's clear, right? It's obvious. So, but yeah, so it's possible that a lot of the therapists that would benefit you in this way, that know what they're doing, are in private practice. Now, if you have medical insurance and you have good enough medical insurance, it often will pay for private practicing therapists. So, but yeah, I mean, I get it. The other thing I'll say is there's a lot of great therapists at agencies. This idea that only good therapists are in private practice is just not true. I've supervised therapists and had colleagues who work at agencies that, they don't earn a lot of money, but they like it because they're not self-employed. They get benefits and vacation time, and they have colleagues and stuff. So, it's just a matter of finding the right person. So, please, Norberta, do not give up. Keep trying. Find the right person. You deserve that. Pop says, I do like that you're talking about suicide and death with dignity. I think that the fear that a therapist has a duty to report is really off-putting when it comes to talking about suicidal thoughts in therapy. These thoughts are probably much more commonplace than generally thought. Agreed. I've lived with suicidal thoughts off and mostly on for the past 20 years. And though I've been in therapy a lot during that time, it's totally a taboo subject because it's really terrifying thinking that a therapist may judge me as being more serious than I am. I'd like to talk about my feelings without the fear of having my autonomy taken away, ending up with a huge medical bill, and fear of loss of privacy because everyone I know would find out why I was missing for a time. This is just anecdotal, but I would say 50% of therapists are good with suicide. Maybe within that group there's some tiers there, but I would say most therapists are at least a B grade, if you will, because it's not that complicated, and it's a fundamental therapeutic principle that listening to someone helps them, right? And having a good relationship and having to validate someone and have empathy. That's been proven by science time and time again. So most therapists understand that. And when you talk about anything, whether it's suicide or whatever, they're going to have empathy, and they're going to listen to you, and they're going to validate you, and they're going to care. So that's not a complicated thing. It's not a rare thing. But of the people that don't know what they're talking or aren't as good as the others, and this is just anecdotal, there's a very small subset of those will be overreactive. So just because you're not great with suicide doesn't mean that you're overreactive. In fact, anecdotally, what I'll say is most therapists are underreactive. When I'm training people, so I have a system regarding the risk level of suicide. And what I find is most of my trainees will default to a more moderate evaluation of risk. And I will say, no, they're higher risk. I think the tendency is because therapists, they want to avoid the whole thing because it's scary to think about having to take away someone's rights or to have to think about the fact that their client might actually die. A lot of therapists go into denial. It's not universal, but so I wouldn't assume that if you were to talk with the average therapist that they would instantly consider you an imminent threat and would try to take away your rights. That's just not the typical way. In fact, even if that were the case, like you went to a therapist, they had no idea what they're doing, and they were one of those rare therapists that actually had an itchy trigger finger on, saying that you're at imminent risk, they still have to call a government-appointed evaluator. We call them county-designated mental health professionals in my area. Maybe they do all over the states, but I know they do here. And so these are paid professionals who I think part-time will be on call to evaluate those kinds of folks. They might even come to your office or go to your home. Those people are experts, they're super experts on evaluating the imminence of risk of suicide. And so even if a therapist can't say, I am going to take away your rights, that's just not a thing. So for me, when I have a client that is at imminent risk, one, I always try to convince them to go themselves or to develop a very robust safety plan that involves their family, where there's monitoring all the time, so we don't have to go to the hospital. But when I do have to, hospitalize someone, I'm always trying to work collaboratively with that client. In the rare case where I have to involuntarily commit them, my dogs are barking, I will have to call the county designated MHPs. They come to my office or they go to the person's home and they conduct the evaluation. And often they find that they don't agree with me that they're not at imminent risk, and thus the individual isn't involuntarily committed. Because to involuntarily place someone in a hospital, and it's for 72 hours in my area, that's a massive violation of someone's rights, right? So the government is not interested in doing that. Plus, it's expensive. So I wouldn't be as worried. Can it happen? Sure, but it's not the rule. And I don't know where people got that idea. Now, I don't know what community you live in, but in mine, and I think the United States in general is like this. It's just, now, might you find a therapist that doesn't really know how to ask the question, doesn't really know how to react, might have anxiety themselves, and might give you the impression that they just don't even want to talk about it? Yeah, that can happen. But seeking involuntary hospitalization without reason, without cause, is just not something that I see very often. And while I'm on the topic, it's a very similar thing when it comes to the idea that when we call child protective services, that they're just going to come in and take your kids away. You know, some people will be like, their spouse is abusive. You know, they get a divorce and their ex-spouse is physically abusive, or there's possibility of that. The spouse that is not abusive is afraid to call the authorities because they're afraid that the kids are just going to be taken away. Does that happen occasionally? Yeah, but Child Protective Services is not in the business of just instantly taking kids away. What they're in the business of is child safety and well-being. And it's not conducive necessarily to the child's overall well-being to instantly take the kids out. The other thing is, when kids are placed, the government has to pay for that, and it's expensive. Temporary foster care is expensive, and we don't have the money for that. Literally, there will be cases where the child should definitely be taken out of the home, but because of lack of government resources, they can't even do anything about that. And so they would pay for people like me, I used to do this kind of work as a family therapist, to go into the home and actually try to stop the whole thing from happening. But of course, I can't really know, because the kid might not be telling me the truth, this kind of thing, because they're afraid the parents are going to get them or something. You know, so this whole paranoia about being involuntarily hospitalized for suicide or having kids taken away is just completely blown out of proportion. I don't know where it came from, but it's always been present since I started as a therapist, and I'm guessing it predates my work as a therapist by a long shot. So anyway, in conclusion, if you have these concerns, I get it, but find the right therapist and just ask them. So if someone talked with you about suicide, what would you do? If they said, well, I'd instantly try to get them involuntarily hospitalized, or they would say, well, I don't know, I guess I would just talk with them about it. You know, maybe steer clear of them. But if they have some robust approach that seems like it's something that you want to do, then talk with them. You know, it's just a question you ask in initial screening. Teal Swan number 2, good old Stella Annie says, I have seen a lot of different psychologists, therapists, etc., and talked with them about my suicidal thoughts. Not one of them has ever said, think about your family, like the way Teal Swan was saying. It's always been about me and my quality of life. Right, so Stella Annie is talking about how her experience talking to a lot of different therapists is that they didn't do what Teal Swan is saying. Now, do some therapists do what Teal Swan is saying? Starry Night says, maybe you already have it in the works, but I was really hoping your Teal Swan series was going to be more focused on the psychology of her based on what we saw in the deep end. Yeah, it's in the works, believe me. Tomek says, I just wanted to say thank you for being extremely fair and open-minded about Teal Swan. As someone who has benefited from Teal's teachings, it's nice to see a balanced viewpoint rather than just jumping on the bandwagon of hating her. This is probably the most fair interpretation of her that I've seen. Yeah, thanks. Abominable Snowman says, good old Abominable Snowman. I just love that name. It's just so great. The only helpful conversations I've had with therapists on this topic were in an outpatient program designed to address suicide. The others didn't seem to know what they were doing at all. I'm 14 minutes into this reaction video, and so far I've felt comforted by what Teal Swan has said. It is a sort of release to have someone ask you how you would plan and not have them freak out and make you feel more alienated. The plan's going to be there whether it's recognized or not. Yeah, so the key here is that you said the only helpful conversations that you've had with therapists on this topic were in an outpatient program designed to address that specifically. So those therapists were obviously trained and they knew what they were doing. Those therapists are out there, and you talk to other therapists, maybe they didn't know what they were doing. So, it's just a matter of finding the right one. And I apologize on behalf of my industry that you have to shop around. If you're looking for a dentist, in my experience anyway, I just go to the closest dentist to my house and things always work out. So are there differences? Yeah, but not as much as what's in my field, which is embarrassing, frankly. Maybe says, for me, hearing how my potential suicide would devastate my family for the rest of their lives, it's what gets through to me when the waves hit. Right, I think I said that in the video, so thanks for reiterating that for some people, of course not everyone, when we work with people that are at risk, we will bring up the topic of, well, how would your family feel, or who would take care of your kids? And this will help the individual to motivate themselves, to pull them out of, as you say, when the waves hit. It's like, well, no, I'm not going to do it because of this. And then as the wave subsides, then you don't need to remind yourself of that anymore. Now, expert therapists would never just impose that on a client. They would never just say, how would your family? They would never say it that way. They would explore. And typically, the clients who that resonates with, they will state it. They'll, if I'm working with a client, it'll be like, what keeps you from doing it? These kinds of questions. And they might say, well, I don't want to devastate my family. It just would be too much for them. Oh, okay. Well, would you like to add that to the list of things to remind yourself when you start to have an increase in motivation? It's collaborative. It's not like imposed. And can some therapists mess that up? Yeah, clearly. Lucy says, the times where I was suicidal and friends told me to think about the people I'm hurting, it made me feel so much worse and invalidated. I can't imagine any person with suicidal thoughts to be comforted by that. It is just selfish. Maybe people in very collectivistic societies would benefit from that, but it's still toxic. Yeah, again, Lucy, I get it. It doesn't resonate with you. So maybe it would actually help if I actually presented my model of gauging risk. I've done a whole deep dive on this. When I train trainees on this, it takes me weeks, or if not months, of back and forth conversations. So I'm not going to be able to fully describe it. And of course, if any of you are thinking about suicide, or you know someone, find a therapist who can actually help you with that, and call the hotline, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's not a solution in the long term, but it can help people get through the spike in motivation. So, please find a therapist that can actually help. They're out there for sure, and they're not that rare. No risk is there's no suicidal ideation. That's pretty obvious. Low risk is mild ideation. A typical presentation here is that the person thinks about not wanting to live anymore because they're suffering, and they don't have a plan. They don't think about it all the time. They've never attempted this sort of thing. Medium risk is definite ideation, no plan, but they seem to be kind of resolved that they might do it at some point. Okay. High risk, but not imminent, is they have a plan, but there's reasonable evidence that the individual will not carry out that plan soon. So just having a plan doesn't mean you're imminent. In fact, a lot of people who are far from imminent risk have a plan. They're like, well, if I ever did it, I would do it this way. That doesn't necessarily mean imminent risk. That's a very simplistic understanding, and any expert on this topic of assessment would never just say, oh, you have a plan, lock you up. Like, they would just never do that. Now, the safety plan might involve a lot of monitoring, but it doesn't necessarily have to be involuntary treatment, right? 99% of the time, what I am looking for when we get to high risk is ongoing monitoring by family members. And I'm not talking about like you're locked up with your family. It's just a collaborative approach where, say, your spouse or your parents or your friend just doesn't let you out of their sight when your intent spikes. And that could last a few days at the most, maybe a week or something. And it doesn't mean that they're constantly at your side, but it just means that they live with you. If someone lives with you, it makes it easier for them to do that. If they don't live with you, then they might move in with you, or you might move in with them. And there's a lot of other things to the safety plan, of course, like not drinking alcohol, getting rid of the guns. It's a whole complicated thing, and you would obviously work with a clinician on this safety plan. But again, so someone could have pretty intense ideation, have an absolute plan that they've rehearsed in their head a number of times, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're imminent risk. What imminent risk is They have a plan, they have the means to carry out that plan, and there's reasonable evidence that they might carry that plan out soon, meaning sometimes just within the next 48 hours. Because for some people, when I'm working with them, they will say, I'm pretty sure this is going to happen. I will say, will it happen between today and our next session? And this isn't the only question I ask, by the way. There's lots of things. And of course, there's a robust safety plan in addition to this. But if they say something like, well, no, I'm not going to do it this week. And I would say, well, why? I'd be like, well, this reason, this reason. So even though they're intensely intending on doing it, they have a plan, they have the means, they know how to do it, but they tell me that they are not going to do it in the next week, and we have a robust safety plan, and I have reasons to believe that they're going to follow this safety plan, and I know that I have a collateral, like a family member that will be around, then I don't gauge that person as imminent risk. Other people might, but I don't usually see that. And if a therapist did gauge that as imminent risk, and again, those government officials, those government designated mental health professionals come in and evaluate, they probably wouldn't see that as imminent because, those individuals see the most imminent at risk people. And thus, if you're not really quite there yet, they're like, well, call us if the risk gets higher because they're close, but they're not high. You know what I mean? So I'm saying all this because I want people to understand that experts, and they're out there, we do not, including the government, does not want to just lock people up. Plus, that just gets them through 3 days. So unless you have an overall approach, what good does that do? Plus, if you alienate a client by forcing them to be hospitalized, then what good does that do, right? And they never come back to therapy, or they don't come to therapy because they've learned that we have an itchy trigger finger on getting them involuntarily hospitalized. Like, we all understand this, right? We're the experts. We've been there. We've worked with these people. We know what's going on. So the fact that you have these thoughts, the experts, we've worked with other people in that situation. You're not the only one. You know what I mean? Hirandam says, I hope he watches her episode on narcissism and what she identifies as the root of narcissism. I am so curious as to what he would think about that. Yeah, I'll try to check that out. All right, so switching to emails about the trial, listener Jen from Hawaii says, one of my best friends texted me and told me that I am histrionic because her therapist told her so. How can a therapist diagnose a person without ever seeing or speaking to them? Well, listener Jen from Hawaii, they can't. It's unethical, it's ridiculous, it's nonsense. It's also possible that your friend isn't telling the truth, or at least misunderstood. So if a client comes to a therapist and says, my friend is like this, and the therapist is like, oh, kind of sounds histrionic, I don't know. Some clients will walk away with, oh, my therapist just diagnosed my friend, when the therapist just threw out a suggestion or something. But can some therapists diagnose from afar, and do they? Yeah, it happens all the time, unfortunately. Megan from Indiana says, in the trial and with Emily and Kobe from 90 Day Fiancé, I've noticed a concerning tendency for people to come down much harder on the woman than on the man. For Emily and Kobe, there was an overwhelming number of comments on the 90 Day Fiancé subreddit stating that she deserved to be told, shut the F up. Because if you watch 90 Day Fiancé, Kobe said that to Emily. For Amber Heard, I have noticed that Johnny Depp fans also have endless justifications for his behavior and endless judgment and hate for her. While I agree that Emily and Amber both seem to bear the majority of the blame for the toxicity in their relationships, I wonder why the collective is so quick to let the men in their lives completely off the hook for their own poor behavior. It reads as very misogynistic to me. Absolutely, Megan. Yeah, I've been saying this for years about various different events in our history and our society, and I noticed that about the trial as well. And I about halfway through the trial, and I started seeing comments and other kinds of news stories and other people talking, other YouTubers, honestly, and I'm like, yikes. It's one thing to say you think that Amber Heard is lying. It's another thing to have the misogynistic comments that people will say. And they're out there. If you haven't seen it, consider yourself lucky, but it's out there, and it's awful. Misogyny is alive and well in our society, and if there's ever been an excuse by society to lean into one's misogyny and express it, it's through this trial, because it seems clear that the vast majority consider her to be a punching bag and some kind of lightning rod for their insecurities. And so, yeah. And I've noticed it about Emily as well. Not as much, but I noticed, I thought, well before the shut the F up thing happened, when there were just debates about whether or not Kobe was going to sleep in the bed at night, the people were coming down so hard on her. Again, it's one thing to think that you think she's criticizable or that she's wrongheaded. It's another thing to just, body shame her, or all the bullying that happens to her. And I've seen it to some extent with Kara on 90 Day Fiancé, with Ariella for sure, and a little bit with Thais on the current season of 90 Day Fiancé. Again, you can criticize them, you can not like them, but the rhetoric from the misogynists online, and misogyny knows no bounds regarding gender. It's probable that more men engage in misogyny, but clearly people of all genders engage in misogyny, and I see that. I can't know for sure, but when you just, so Megan, Megan, I agree with you. Clint from New Jersey, he says, if I'm correct, I believe abuse victims can at times act erratically and even hurt their abuser. Shouldn't this be considered when talking about Johnny? Is it a disservice to him to automatically consider him in a bidirectional abusive relationship when most of the aggression is coming from Amber? Well, just chiming in here, Clint, one, I don't automatically consider him to be in a bidirectional abusive relationship. Automatically, like, that sounds like I'm not thinking about the data, and I have. So one. Two, my conclusion is I don't know, because how could I know? It's a trial where everyone literally could be lying because they're trying to win a trial or make themselves look good. So there's just no, and even based on what they said, it's still hard to tell because you'd have to be there. You'd have to kind of be in their heads. So is it a disservice for anyone to automatically consider anything about the trial? Yeah, including what you said. You say also, are we faster to place a bidirectional label when the abuser is a woman and the victim is a man? Absolutely. Happens all the time. Maybe a majority of the time. I don't know. Are we prejudging him on being violent because he is on drugs? Could be. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm certainly not biased that way. I've worked extensively with people with substance abuse issues, and that would never be my assumption. I also, and then you go on to say, I also believe it is bidirectional. However, I think I might be doing that because it is socially safer. Yeah, so I'm glad you're asking that question, Clint. You're thinking, it seems bidirectional to me, but I wonder if gender is playing a role in that. Let's ask some questions. And you are, and that's great. That's wise. There's no way to answer that question. But if we don't ask the question, then we're not given a chance to think about it, which is what you're doing. Jasmine from Australia says, I'm a new clinician in the mental health field and am recovering from complex PTSD. I have borderline traits and have just been married 5 months. My husband and I had approximately 5 instances of physical abuse in our 5-year relationship, of which all but one were instigated by myself. Listening to your perspective and how you have held Amber accountable for her behavior whilst holding a compassionate stance has allowed me to acknowledge the ways that I have hurt my husband by assaulting him in the past. I have had so much shame and fear about this part of our relationship that I have not been able to have a good look at the dynamic. I am still scared and feel enormous amounts of grief and shame about this part of who I am, but your coverage of this case has made this much easier to understand about myself. P.S. I have a great therapist and I am okay, so no need to stress about my safety. Yeah, Jasmine, I wasn't worried about your safety. There was nothing in there that made me worry about your safety, but I did worry that you didn't have someone to talk to about this so you could continue to capitalize on this insight. So that's great. But yeah, Jasmine, fantastic. And I've gotten a lot of emails and comments like this. People saying, I think I've been abusive to my partner, and watching the trial made me feel worse about myself to some extent, especially the way people were reacting to Amber and Johnny. But then watching your reaction videos made me feel like, oh, well, maybe I can learn to accept that, unfortunately, I do engage in this behavior. And I have a framework of understanding where that comes from, which gives me a solution and gives me compassion for myself. I still don't like this about myself, but I'm dedicating myself to changing it. Jasmine, high praise. You're wonderful. All right, 90 Day Fiancé emails. Upper tier patron Amy G. from Corvallis, Oregon says, I would like to point out some things about the K-1 visa rules that seem to be lost on 90 Day Fiancé. For example, Jabri's mother seems to think that Jabri should postpone the wedding. If he were dating an American citizen, this choice would be fairly low stakes. However, Miona must exit the U.S. before the visa expires, and her K-1 visa is then permanently canceled. Next, the couple would have to wait 2 years before they would be allowed to reapply. After that, they would spend another 10 to 13 months applying, pay all the fees again, and hope that the U.S. consulate approves her visa a second time despite their failure to get married the first time. And there is a lifetime limit of 2 K-1 visas per U.S. citizen. When I saw Miona's reaction about postponing the wedding, I thought it was very understandable. She's not willing to spend another 3 to 4 years of her life dating him remotely and may fear that he could just as easily back out at a second time. Yeah, I didn't know that, up to your patron Amy from Corvallis, Oregon. That is interesting. That absolutely, to me, the way this show comes across, and maybe just my stupidity, I was assuming that, well, she goes back and then they get another K-1 visa and, say 6 months she comes back. But clearly that is not the case. I mean, there's a chance that she could never come back. And yeah, so to postpone the wedding is, it's a huge deal. Anonymous YouTube subscriber says, as a Muslim, it was weird listening to Bilal talk about a prenup. When they did the spiritual marriage ceremony in Trinidad, it was kind of a prenup in and of itself. In Islam, when you sign the marriage contract, there is a detail regarding divorce. If the man divorces the woman, he has to pay a sum of money that has been agreed on in the contract. But I think Bilal isn't sure if Shaida respects the Islamic law and is afraid she'll go to the U.S. government to take more money. If I were Shaida, that would make me feel horrible. Interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. The whole thing about this storyline is like kind of confusing because they're already married. I would assume that for the two of them, being married under God is much more significant than being married under the government of the United States. But I don't know. Neelan says, meaning that the whole debate as to whether or not they should get married, you would think like, well, it's a done deal. We're married under God. So, let's make this work. Not that they have to think about it that way, but Neelan says, if personality disorders are special categories for a specific set of traits that cause tremendous dysfunction, I think that creating archetypes is a bit dangerous and misleading. Right. So I was talking about in the last comments episode, I believe a couple weeks ago, that I was talking about maybe developing a list of archetypes, like Stephen and Alina is this sort of personality disorder or something. And I hope I was clear. I wasn't saying I was diagnosing. I was saying that the way the data presented on the show exhibited what might be found later with proper examination to be somewhere on this spectrum. Now, of course, when I say stuff like that, a lot of people misinterpret it as I'm diagnosing someone, which I should be responsible about and maybe not do. But anyway, so I was talking about that, and I hadn't really started it, but I was talking about it because if we're going to learn about these things, sometimes it can help to have a person, like, for example, when I lecture on certain issues, I like to have a client in my mind that is a good example that I speak from. Like, even when I'm talking on this YouTube channel, when I talk about certain issues, I'm often thinking about a particular person, because to just talk generally about an issue, psychologically speaking, it's kind of hard to really teach it unless you have it grounded in some sort of real person, right? So if I have that person, I'm not talking about that person, but I'm grounding everything I'm saying. Does it make sense given that person? That kind of, anyway. And it also provides, I think, a platform for compassion, because, in my head, I know that person, I care about that person, and so the way that I talk is as if that person were sitting next to me, I guess, and I wouldn't say anything that would hurt their feelings, Anyway, but you say here, it might validate people in foisting mental disorders on anyone. In my mind, all human beings have virtues, defects, and personality traits. Some flaws are morally reprehensible behaviors or harmful personality traits, but that doesn't mean that all human beings have personality disorders. I understand that you are well aware of this. So I get it. People who've been through trauma never saw it coming, but presenting it in such a light judgment, doesn't it misrepresent normal human interactions? I honestly wonder. Yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with that idea, but given what you're saying and also given what I was already thinking, I will probably not do it. But it is kind of interesting to think about, right? Or maybe there's like other kinds of traits that come across as less judgmental, like introversion, extroversion, or something like that. I don't know. Listener Sandra says, it's never occurred to me to see the Stevens of this world, Stephen and Alina. It's never occurred to me to see the Stevens of the world with empathy, even though I am someone that has always seen themselves as extremely empathetic. However, when it came to Stephen's religion, I did join the vast majority in thinking that he was imposing it on others, and that was just wrong. Even with that, I failed to really see where Stephen was coming from, like I did with Alina. In that moment, my knee-jerk reaction was to reject him without really thinking it through and admitting to my biases. I was not being differentiated. Thank you, Dr. Honda. It really is a journey to become differentiated, empathetic, and understanding, and also finding and recognizing where society has conditioned us to reject certain things. Thank you for helping facilitate my growth. Well, music to my ears, Sandra. That is one of the best things you could ever say about my work. Jose and Anfisa, number 13. Vivian says, I was just like Anfisa when I was younger. Not the gold digger part, but I was scared because I cared too much about my relationships. I had no idea how controlling and abusive I was because that was modeled by my parents. I started watching Dr. Honda 2 years ago, and that's where I learned about my childhood trauma and what insecurity looks like. Thanks to your channel, I am now very happily in therapy and working through my trauma to learn how to function like a mentally healthy person. Thank you, Dr. Honda. Thanks to you, I realized how hurt I was, and thanks to you, I learned how to find help. Well, Vivian, also, music to my ears. That is fantastic. And what a great thing that you've done for you and your relationships, that you've looked at yourself and healed. That's fantastic. Bilal and Shida, number 13. Holly says, my mind short-circuited when he called her argumentative. Yeah. I mean, either we're missing something about Shida's behavior or Bilal is distorted. You make the call. Tyler says, more 90-Day Fiancé, please. Thanks, Internet Dad. God. I don't know why I have a mixture of feelings when people call me dad on the internet. It feels warm and nice, but it also feels, I don't know, it's unfamiliar to me for people on the internet to call me dad. And then there's the whole daddy thing. Anyway, ultimatum number 12, Robot says, one of the best things I've learned from psychology in Seattle is how to properly apologize. My partner and I used to bicker and misunderstand each other frequently, and I am sitting here trying to recall the last time that happened. I can't. It's been ages. So a million thanks, Professor Honda. Well, Robot, I'm getting a lot of nice things here. that you've learned how to properly apologize, and that now you and your partner don't bicker and misunderstand each other. I mean, and, Robot, I believe you, because I believe that too. Like, not only how to properly apologize, but how to properly communicate from our feelings, that kind of thing. It's a game changer. When I learned this stuff, it was a game changer. It hasn't solved all of my problems, but it solves so many issues. We just have no modeling regarding this sort of thing. Especially if you follow popular culture, the guidance around this sort of stuff is you got to have boundaries, you got to be firm, you got to tell them, that they're the a-hole, you got to stand up for yourself, or you got to let it go, or, all this really destructive notions that are the opposite of what actually helps. And I'm glad you found it useful as I did. Big Al says, Dr. Kirk, this ep was amazing. Which one are you talking about? Oh, Ultimatum. I've always felt attached to my jealousy. It's been my blind spot. If I can find a way to express my true fear without the baggage, everyone would feel more secure. Thanks for discussing this topic. I got a lot out of it. Well, good, Big Al, again. wonderful. I'm glad that you're, thinking about where the jealousy actually comes from and how it can be destructive, but it does come from a logical human place. And if you understand that, then you know where to direct those feelings, i.e. that you feel insecure you're going to lose your partner. And if you can just communicate that more directly, you often can be a lot more reassured. Hannah says, I am really curious what it says about me that I don't feel triggered by Colby while so many other people are. To me, Colby comes off like someone who is trying to be stoic in the face of an emotional situation and insecurity, not really feeling anything outside of the norm of my environment from him. Wonder what Dr. Honda would speculate about my traumas if Colby just feels average to me. Well, Hannah, I would speculate, because I have a similar reaction as you do. I saw him, it was hard to detect because he comes across as stoic and like he doesn't care, but it doesn't take much to imagine that what's going on behind that mask is a lot of insecurity, which I think we've found enough data for, but who knows. But so you're saying, what are my traumas that I'm so different from everyone else is what you're asking, Hannah. How, everyone else hates Colby. How come I'm not triggered by him? What's wrong with me? No, Hannah. I think what you're doing now, should you be triggered by someone else? No, I think if you ever watch me watching these shows, which I guess if you're watching this, you probably do, and you wonder why I'm not being triggered, it's because I am experienced at and a paid professional at looking past people's defenses. So when I see things that would trigger me if I thought it was just representative of like who they are, I would be triggered, but I don't see that. I see, like when someone, well, anyway, you know what I'm saying. I think, Hannah, what you're seeing is you're seeing past the defenses, and thus it doesn't trigger you because you see the vulnerability there. It doesn't make the defenses okay, but it doesn't trigger you in that way. Anyway, Miss Manawaka says, thank you for this video, Dr. Honda. This is exactly how my husband acts when there's a disagreement, acting like Colby. Very crazy making. I've never been so frustrated with a human that I am with when I am with him when he is like this. Yeah, Miss Manakawa, it is crazy making and aggravating when people act that way, the way Colby was. The key is to try to see past it or talk about your feelings, like, hey, when you act like this, it makes me feel like you're distant. Are you distant? Ultimatum 15, Carissa says, I haven't watched this couple, Ray and Zay. I haven't watched this couple outside of this reaction video, but as the talker in my relationship, it is hard to come down from that. The urge to say everything right away is so strong. I'm working on exactly this in therapy, and it really helps. I am also loud. I come from a family that is very loud, and when I talk to my husband, who comes from a very quiet family, it's overwhelming to him. Therapy really helps with this. I didn't realize how my behavior was affecting my family. Again, good for you, Carissa. Pseudonym says, question, Dr. Honda, are there ever times you would advise couples to break up? When I watched this show, The Ultimatum, I felt like none of these people were ready for marriage. Yeah, I've talked about this before. Early on in my career, at the beginning of my career, I was told to never say things like that as a couples therapist or even as an individual therapist, because it assumes that I know what's best for a client, which of course I don't. So I didn't do it in the beginning, but I did have thoughts in my head. Over time, over the first 10 years of my career, that notion that this couple or that couple should break up or be together for that matter slowly got erased, because I learned through experience that when we from the outside look at someone, at a couple, at a relationship, it can feel a way to us because we're filtering it through our own feelings, our own experiences, our own bias, and we have no idea what it's like to be in that relationship, right? So it's the question just doesn't even cross my mind anymore. And it doesn't, occasionally it'll cross my mind when I'm watching the show, when it really goes beyond the pale. And I often hopefully conclude, well, the show is editing it in a certain way. Like, I remember thinking that about Jovi and Yara, thinking, I don't know if they should be together. I mean, they were, I don't know if you remember the very beginning of that season they were on, but they were yelling at each other a lot and being pretty mean to each other and real manipulative both, and playing pranks on each other, and they didn't have any trust, and they just seemed to be in the business of trying to ridicule each other. I'm just like, why are they in a relationship? And I might have said something like that. But over time, we realized, oh, behind the scenes, they were very, very much in love. So what we're presented with, and it's analogous to when a friend or someone goes to therapy and you only hear the bad stuff, right? You don't know. And you'll often hear me say things like, I'm guessing behind the scenes there's more functionality and there's more of a bond. I'm saying that to remind you, but also to remind myself of that. So yeah, no, I never recommend a couple break up. Now, if someone says, is it okay if I break up, or would it be terribly stupid if I break up or something like that? I might offer my opinion and say something like, no, it's your choice if you want to, and if they say, well, could you see reasons, say I'm in individual therapy with someone for 5 years. This isn't a terribly uncommon scenario. They're talking about their marriage all the time. They're trying to mull it over, and, we explore all that. And then at a certain point, they start thinking they want a divorce, and they say, so I'm pretty sure I want a divorce, but could you tell me from your perspective, why that would be a good idea or not? I don't know. Even as I say that, I wouldn't answer that question. Because one, it's not therapeutic to just tell someone information like that as if somehow I'm more of an expert than they are. And it's better if I can help the client explore for themselves. But two, I just don't even really believe I know how to answer that question to people. I just don't. It's similar to like, if someone was like in therapy and they're saying, so I'm at this job and there's pros and cons to this job. There's like this and this, but I got offered this other job and there's like pros and cons and this and this. What should I do? Well, it's like, I don't know. What do you want? Right? Now, it might take years and years for that client to figure out what they want, but so it's not necessarily an easy question to answer. But how in the world would I know if they should be at that job or not? But somehow when it comes to relationships, we all feel like we know everything. Like, well, they shouldn't be together. It's like, how would you know? You don't know what needs are at play. You don't know what really goes on behind the scenes. So, Linda says, I like the trial. Having said that, is it potentially not wrong-headed if you have a friend that's being abused to say, I don't think you should be in this relationship? No, it's not particularly wrong-headed. So I'm not saying we never can provide an opinion, right? But as a therapist, even in situations like that, and I struggled with this with a few clients that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't know if you noticed that, but I was scratching both at the same time. That I would have clients that were in individual therapy who I was assessing as being abused by their partner emotionally. And I would really fight against the undifferentiated urge to try to influence the client to divorce or break up. And I would have to dedicate myself to the cause at the beginning of the session, but often I would lose differentiation about 30 minutes into the session. And then after the session, I would realize, I lost differentiation about halfway through through the session. And I started to have a vibe where I was frustrated that they weren't divorcing their partner yet. And even though, let's just say I'm right about the decision that it's right and just that they divorce, it does no good to the client for me to impose that point of view or to pressure them. It just doesn't help, because if they're not ready to do that, not only are they in a bad situation, but now they think I'm judging them for their behavior. And it's countertransferential in that the individual who's being abused, well, there's a lot of different things I could say, but at the very least I could say it's additionally kind of abusive for me to assume what is best for the client and to tell them what to do. At the very least, it infantilizes them, right? That somehow this abuse victim is an idiot and doesn't know what to do. They need me to sort of push them, right? It's another pressuring element in their life. They're being abused by their partner, and now I'm pressuring them and judging them, which that's a terrible position to put someone in. So I am frequently really trying to provide this vibe, not only outwardly, but inwardly, of like, I don't know what's best. What do you think? I'll support whatever you want to do, but what do you want to do? Linda says, I liked the trial videos, but I am so glad we are done with them and we can go back to watching crazy reality TV shows. Well, Linda, I agree. I was recording some episodes yesterday for 90 Day Fiancé, and I just felt like I was back home in some ways. I don't know. So on one level, I feel like I'm back home and I'm much more comfortable. On the other hand, I feel like it's kind of, well, it's not as intense as the trial stuff. The trial stuff, it seemed like so much more was at stake. Not necessarily for them, of course it was, but in terms of like the topics that we were, mulling over. So on one level, I kind of missed that. But on another level, yeah, it's like I went on this super chaotic, exciting vacation, but then I come back home to 90 Day Fiancé and I'm just Netflix and chilling. I'm TLC and chilling. Is that a thing? I gotta Google that. Yeah, I found one result of TLC and chill, and it's on bestoftees.com. It is a t-shirt that says TLC and chill. One thing on the entire internet. I did the quotes, TLC and chill. One result in the entire universe. She says, I remember watching this scene in The Ultimatum with Ray and Zay fighting and couldn't wait to see your take on it. I thought the mom had done quite well considering she would have emotional involvement with both of them. However, most people online really disliked the mom, so I was wondering what I missed. She's called Irina. Oh, you're full. She's called Irina, so maybe your name's Irina. That I often have a similar reaction, like I'll be reacting or watching, and then I'll see comments or people email me, or I'll see other posts around on Reddit or something, and I'm just like, whoa, like the consensus is they hate that person, like Emily, this sort of thing. And I'm like, did I miss something? And you had the same thought. You're like, most people really disliked the mom. It was Ray's mom, right? Did I miss something? Yeah. Now, who knows? Maybe you and I, Irina, are the weird ones, and everyone else could convince us that all the rhetoric and the hate was justified. I don't know. The Ultimatum 16. Anna Cecilia says, I am so sorry about all the hate and threats that you are getting. Thanks. But I hope that you also see that we are so many people that love and appreciate your efforts and content. Oh, thanks. My husband is a stand-up comic that recently blew up on social media, and he's really been struggling with the negative comments. He told me today that listening to you talking about going through the same thing really helped him. Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for hanging it out there. You are so appreciated. Well, yeah. Well, tell your husband that I'll hang it out there whenever he wants. He's a comedian. He'll appreciate that. Ultimatum 17, Antonia says, I am dying to watch you react to Pedro and Chantel. I hope you get the chance to do it from beginning to end. Well, Antonia, yes, Pedro and Chantel are high on the list because they've been on the list for a long time, because I surveyed everyone in terms of, okay, what other couple should I do? And Pedro and Chantel always show up, top 3, top 5 or something. And also, it's fun for me to have so much material, right? Because it's one thing to watch just one season and get kind of an introduction. It's another thing to have, because my understanding is there are multiple seasons, right? So that would be fun. It's like when I went back and started watching Darcy from beginning to end. It was interesting to watch all this data crammed into a short amount of time, And Fisa and George, similar thing. It's fun to go back. I mean, fun is interesting. It's professionally gratifying to me. So yeah, I do want to do that eventually. Maybe by the end of this year, I'll start. I don't know. We'll see. Mick says, after hearing you mention Nate and Lauren's disagreement on having kids on The Ultimatum, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on couples where this disagreement is their main issue. I personally believe that this is not reconcilable. I do not want kids. I make this clear on the first date because I don't want to waste anyone's time, mine or theirs. Yeah, Mick, well, 1, good for you that you know what you want, and because you've explored it, and 2, you make it clear on the first date, which is fantastic. You could even make it clear in your profile. You could even only swipe right on people that also have that profile or something. Anyway, but yeah, absolutely. And often when I'm reacting on these shows, I'm sad for the couple because they realize after falling in love and maybe after they get married, that they have a major deal breaker like this. I have a friend of mine, it's actually a friend of my wife's, who ran into this where she wanted, not my wife, but my wife's friend, she wanted kids for sure, and he did not. But they loved each other, and they were like, but so do we break up just because of that? Or what do we do? It's hard to find someone that we're... So it was a lot of turmoil around that. And yeah, and now, would it have been better if they had said right from the beginning and just decided not to date? It's kind of hard to tell, right? Because I don't know what they would say to that. I don't know if they would say like, yeah, we should never have met. It was a disaster. Or would they say, well, but I really loved being with them for the time we were together, and I wouldn't give that up for anything. So I don't know. But it's obviously safer to say it right up front. But it's not necessarily unreconcilable, for sure. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on how flexible someone is. It depends on, because it's not like when people say they definitely want kids or don't want kids, most people understand that there's a lot of factors that play into that, right? You know, it's sort of be like if having kids would give them a 75% chance of dying during childbirth. You know, some people would be like, well, I really want to have my own biological children, but I don't want to risk dying. So, you know, people, when they say, I definitely want kids or I definitely don't want kids, it's not like there are other needs and goals that aren't around the same priority level or will, supersede it. So there's that. And also, people change over time. Some people will change their minds. Some people have a hard preference regarding that, but they haven't really put it to the test. You know, for example, just going in the other direction, someone says, I don't want kids, I don't want kids, I don't want kids. They meet someone, fall in love, they move in together, and their partner wants to have kids. And they start introducing this idea. It's like, well, if we have kids, what if we did this, what if we did? And the person who didn't want to have kids, they might start thinking, well, you know, I could see it working between us. And I never thought I'd be the sort of person that would want kids, but I think like maybe. Now, as I always say, often when someone states they don't want to have kids, particularly women, it's assumed that they're in that category. Like, well, they'll warm up to it, completely discounting what they're saying. So I'm not saying like it's that flexible, and you should never assume that, obviously. The way people state it, you should assume that that's how it's going to stay. It might change over time. It's complicated, but yeah, Mick, you're doing a good job by just making it clear, and then you just find someone else who doesn't want to have kids. There's a lot of fish in the sea. A good percentage of them do not want to have kids. And then you two can swim off together. I was going to make a spawning salmon reference because I'm in the Pacific Northwest, but the parents die after spawning, and you watch them decay in the river, you know, salmon days in Issaquah. So I don't want to give that analogy, Mick, because that doesn't, if you're into that, anyway. All right, everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.